Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Mellings. I'm the founder of ADISA. We are a UK-based certification body offering certifications against different standards in different jurisdictions as well. But we are here today to talk about a new certification for the legal services called the Legal Services Operational Privacy Certification Scheme, which thankfully is shortened to LOCS. Now, LOCS 23 has been evolved out of a need which was seen by Tim Hyman, who's the scheme owner, for more transparency where data protection compliance is concerned, ironically in the legal services sector, and that's the genesis of what we're here to talk about today. It's a very long process to get GDPR certification status, 3+ years, and we've reached the final stages of that now, and we're delighted to have all the main people associated with the work that's gone in so far. So we have Sarah from the ICO, we have Susie from UKAS, we have Tim, who's the scheme owner, and they're the three main components in this. But we're also importantly joined by some of the early adapters of LOCS 23, and we're going to be talking to them about the reasons why they've taken the leap to become certified against this new standard. And then we will finish at the end with an open panel session where you, the audience, will be able to ask questions about LOCS or any other aspect which you feel that the panel will be able to assist you with. But the main reason for you coming here today is to listen to the experts on LOCS 23. So I'm delighted to introduce you to Sarah Carr from the Information Commissioner's Office, who's going to talk to you today just about the basis of what is a UK GDPR certification scheme. So Sarah, thanks very much, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Steve. Okay, so as Steve said, for those that don't know, I'm Sarah Carr from the Information Commissioner's Office. We're the regulator for the UK GDPR for data protection, among other pieces of legislation. And Steve's asked me to just explain a bit about what UK GDPR certification is, what the benefits are, and what our role is in relation to that. So GDPR introduced the accountability principle, which means that organisations need to be able to demonstrate their compliance with the law. And UK GDPR certification to an ICO approved scheme is intended as a way for organisations to do that, to be able to demonstrate that they've implemented appropriate technical and organisational measures as referred to in the law. So certification must relate to processing of personal data connected with a particular product, process or service. It can't be for individuals or for organisations as a whole. And it can provide lots of benefits for organisations. It can help them provide assurance to customers, clients and the regulator that they're complying with their data protection obligations. Data processors can use it to provide guarantees to controllers that they've got the appropriate measures in place when processing personal data. And it also reduces the risk of non-compliance. So it sets out all the rules that you need to follow to comply with the law, and the ICO take adherence to certification schemes as a mitigating factor when considering any corrective action. It also provides transparency by allowing organisations, customers, both individuals and other businesses, to be able to quickly assess the level of data protection of a particular product, process or service. So a scheme is made up of 3 core elements. So I hope it'll become clear why I'm pointing this out just now. So the certification criteria, these form the standard that the conformity of a product or service is assessed against. So the specific data protection requirements in this case relating to the processing. So that's what the LOCS standard is. Then you've got the specification of audit and testing methods that are used by the certification body to carry out that assessment. And finally, you've got the scheme rules for the management and operation of the scheme. So our role at the ICO is to assess and approve the certification criteria for the scheme. The schemes are delivered by certification bodies accredited by UKAS. who are the UK Accreditation Service, and they assess the audit methodology and the scheme operation as part of the accreditation process. So this is just an outline of the different roles and responsibilities of the organisations involved in UK GDPR certification. So there's 4 main bodies. Firstly, the ICO. So our role is to set additional requirements for accreditation of certification bodies in addition to those set out in ISO 17065, which are the requirements for accreditation requirements for bodies certifying products, processes and services. We are also required to approve certification scheme criteria submitted by independent third parties even, sorry. Lost the ability to speak. So we have an agreement in place with UKAS to provide accreditation services as the UK's national accreditation body. So then we've got scheme owners. So they're independent third parties who may or may not also be certification bodies, and their role is to develop scheme documents, including the criteria, rules for certification bodies operating the scheme, and sometimes possibly including the audit methodology. They also need to update the scheme to reflect any changes to law or guidance or opinions, legal case law, and feedback from certification bodies. So then we have UKAS. So as I've already said, their role is to accredit certification bodies to deliver certification schemes against the accreditation requirements that I just mentioned, and accreditation's valid for up to 5 years. They will then monitor certification bodies to make sure they're still complying with those rules and can revoke accreditation where a certification body no longer meets the requirements. Then lastly, but by no means least, we've got the certification bodies. So they're the ones operating the scheme who certify the controllers and processors against the approved criteria, and that lasts for up to 3 years depending on the scheme, following an assessment by them as to whether the organisation satisfies the agreed criteria. As part of that, they inform the ICO before granting or renewing certification and provide us with reasons that they've made those decisions, and carry out periodic reviews of certification as a minimum annually to make sure organisations are still following the rules of the scheme. They can carry out a review if they're informed of any suspected compliance issues, and can also withdraw certification where criteria are no longer met. So that's all the different moving parts. So then I just thought it might be helpful to just explain a bit about our criteria approval process. So this is our main role in UK GDPR certification, to approve the scheme criteria which set out the data protection requirements. We are in the process of streamlining this, but this here is what the LOCS scheme went through in order to gain approval. So our team work with scheme owners and certification bodies during the development stage of a scheme, and once criteria are submitted, we carry out an initial assessment, and we look at things such as the general format of the documents and the language used, whether the scope is clearly defined and meaningful and not misleading, whether the criteria cover all the relevant aspects of the processing and the law that relate to the scope, and ultimately whether it allows for meaningful data protection certification which will be understandable to the intended audience, including the data subjects. So once our initial requirements are met, the next step is full assessment by the ICO certification team alongside subject matter experts from across the ICO. So this involves a detailed line-by-line assessment of the criteria. And ultimately, we're looking at how well the scheme practically applies the law and is likely to improve data protection compliance of controllers and processors and benefit the information rights of data subjects. So that can take some time, as Tim will attest to, and some toing and froing. And once we've agreed a final version, they're submitted to our Deputy Commissioner for formal approval and published on our website. There's a register there where you can find all the schemes that we've approved. We will then notify UKAS of the approval, and once they've determined that the criteria is suitable for accreditation, certification bodies can then obtain accreditation to deliver a scheme based on those criteria, which is what ADISA are going through now. So we have to date approved 5 sets of certification scheme criteria relating to age assurance, age appropriate design, IT asset disposal, which is ADISA's own scheme, training qualification services, as well as this scheme for legal services. And we've got a few other schemes at various stages of development in the areas of financial services, online tracking, as well as a more general scheme. So that is me. Thank you for your time. Steve's going to take any questions at the end. If you want to contact us, you can, that's all the ways that you can do that. And then I'm going to hand over to Susie. Thank you.
I'm just going to interject before Susie takes over. I've been very remiss. I apologise. The disclaimer is we are recording today. And I should say that in the audience that we're with, I need to make sure that I disclose that. So we are recording this session. I apologise. I forgot that at the beginning. Susie, over to you, who's representing UKAS today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. And hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here. I'm Susie Daly, and I'm the External Affairs Manager at UKAS. I'm here in place of my colleague, Alistair Hunter, who some of you may know. I'm just going to spend a few minutes just talking about UKAS, our role as the national accreditation body, and just a little bit about accreditation and specifically what the kind of distinctions are between accreditation and certification. So thanks again for your time. So perhaps it might maybe useful to start off to say who we are. Sorry, Zoe, could you possibly make this a little bit bigger? Sorry, guys. Right. Okay. Yeah, so first of all, we were established as the sole national accreditation body for the United Kingdom. We were first established in 1995, but there's been an accreditation service, a national accreditation service, back since 1966. It was originally the British Calibration Service. So we're independent of government, but we operate under a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Business and Trade on behalf of government as a whole. And the Business Department, they own the conformity assessment and accreditation policy for the UK. And what we do is also underpinned by regulation, previously EU regulation 765. It was transferred over under GB RAMS. But that basically stipulates that in the UK, accreditation must be a public authority activity. So we have a duty to act in the public interest, and our sort of mantra is we're commercially aware, because accreditation can be a market-driven activity, but we're not commercially driven. So as I say, strictly not-for-profit, non-profit distributing, and we have shareholders, not members, and our shareholders include government departments and regulators, professional bodies, consumer associations, and the like. And what we basically do, we're assessing for conformity with an established competence criteria, and they tend to be international standards, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment. And also a key thing is that we are a core component of the UK's national quality infrastructure. And again, I will say a little bit more about in a moment. Okay, so what is accreditation? Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a difficulty with my slides, just bear with me. Okay, so we've got a nice pithy definition there. So it's the formal recognition that an organisation, in this instance, we're talking about certification bodies, which are a type of conformity assessment body. It's the formal recognition that body is technically competent to perform specific conformity assessment activities. And again, in this instance, we're talking about certification as a specific conformity assessment activity, and that they can do that in a reliable, credible and accurate manner. And I would add consistent to that list there, consistently behaving, meeting the requirements. So there are different types of conformity assessment activities. Again, things like testing. So maybe talking about medical labs, you may be talking about digital forensic labs, any sort of lab inspection, certification, again, which is the conformity assessment activity we're particularly interested in here. So it could be a certification of a management system, personnel, product, services, processes, and verification and validation, which is sort of gaining increasing importance now when we're thinking about things like how to demonstrate the credibility of net zero claims and things like that. And if you look to the right of the slide, you'll see that there are, and Sarah's already alluded to them, there's a number of international ISO standards which cover specific accreditation activities. And the one that we're interested in here is 17065 to the left side of the list, and that covers products, services and processes, accreditation of bodies that perform certification activities. So I mentioned the UK's national quality infrastructure, and which UKAS is a fundamental part of. So what is this? So in many ways, it's useful to consider it as kind of the plumbing, which kind of sits underneath the quality supply chain. So it's a system of organisations together with the policies and the relevant legal and regulatory framework, which kind of supports and enhances the quality and safety of goods and products and processes. And you see there's 5 key components, one of which is standards. I'll mention a little bit more about the standards body in a moment. Measurement, which ensures the kind of the accuracy of standards. Conformity assessment activities are the ones that I've mentioned just in the previous slide, and accreditation, which underpins those, and market surveillance, which obviously is a function undertaken by government, OPSS specifically to look at sort of the safety of products on the market, and whether they're sort of continuing to comply with regulatory requirements. So I mentioned there's kind of 5 components. There's 4 key organisations really which are part of that. One I've already mentioned is the Office of Product Safety and Standards, who actually perform that overarching market surveillance function. Us as a national accreditation body, which is sponsored by OPSS, the National Standards Body, British Standards Institution, and the National Physical Laboratory, which is the National Measurement and Metrology Institute. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I know it's a little bit complicated. It was really just to kind of to illustrate kind of the overarching framework really, and how the different sort of components of the national quality infrastructure work together to ensure the quality and safety of products. And how working together they help to provide that sort of confidence throughout the supply chain. So you'll see that again, I mentioned that we have OPSS, the Office of Product Safety and Standards, at the top, and underneath those you have the National Standards Body, who are writing the standards, informed by kind of accurate metrology and calibration from the NPL, and ourselves as the national accreditation body, ensuring compliance, that those standards are being sort of the requirements of those standards are being met and complied with on a consistent basis. And our function, which I will say a bit more about in a moment, is to make sure those bodies doing those audits, those assessments, those certification bodies are actually doing that consistently, competently, and independently. And that again, going down to the next layer, that's giving businesses the confidence really that their products, their services are meeting either sometimes regulatory requirements or just standard requirements to make sure their products are kind of safe, performing well on the market. And then that gives me and you as the consumer and end user confidence that that product is safe, is going to meet the claims that the manufacturer, the producer is making. It's kind of, in a way, it's this whole kind of framework is creating that sort of layer, that sort of landscape of confidence and assurance. Just very briefly, it's worth mentioning also that like the British Standards Institute and NPL, we're sort of part of international frameworks. We're a member of sort of the International Accreditation Federation and the International Laboratory and Accreditation Corporation. And that basically means, importantly, that we're sort of a signatory to a number of mutual recognition agreements. And that means that kind of a UKAS accreditation in the UK is accepted as technically equivalent to the accreditation performed by another signatory. So obviously that helps kind of to reduce technical barriers to trade. That cross-border acceptance reduces the need for sort of duplicative testing. So just briefly want to talk about, there's a few common misunderstandings. Again, I think that's largely around sort of the distinction between accreditations and certification. First of all, it's important to remember that not all conformity assessment bodies are accredited by UKAS. So so obviously in this instance, it's a requirement from the ICO that any sort of certification body that's going to be compliant with the regulation needs to be UKAS accredited, and that's part of government policy. Government policy recommends that if any party, whether it be government or non-government, is looking for third-party conformity assessment, they should look for a UKAS accredited body. So accreditation can often be voluntary. As I say, it's often market driven, but it can often be a statement within supply chains, whether it's at procurement level or further down, that certification body or conformity assessment body is actually UKAS accredited. And again, it's to give that kind of additional kind of layer, of confidence and assurance that you can have trust that the body that's performing the audit has been independently assessed for its own competence. And again, so I think this is the key thing. What's the difference between accreditation and certification? Because they're often used interchangeably, and they're conflated, and they are very closely related, but they're very distinct steps on that sort of quality assurance ladder. So accreditation sits above certification in that it's performing an oversight role that sort of underpins the competence, the quality and impartiality of the certification process. I know we're talking about certification in this instance, but it's important to stress it's not just certification. That's one of a number of conformity assessment activities. So testing activities, for example, would be another example. And certification, it's an independent, it's a third-party audit of whether something, be that a product, a service, a process, is conforming to specific criteria which would be set out in a standard or a scheme, or could indeed be some sort of regulatory requirement. Again, it's just really to make just to kind of highlight those differences. So if you think about certification, is the assessment of whether a system, product, or process or person is meeting the criteria laid out in a recognised standard or scheme. For example, one of the most well-known standards that can be a certification body can audit an organisation against would be something like ISO 9001, which many of you will have heard of, the management system standard. But accreditation, sitting above that, is the determination that that organisation is actually competent to perform that assessment, that it's doing it not only competently, but it's doing it independently, free from any conflict of interest, partiality. It's not, and as I say, we're operating in the non-commercial sphere, and I suppose that helps to give that sort of added assurance. I suppose so. In summary, I would just say accreditation matters because we've been sort of underpinning technical competence in conformity assessment activities for over 50 years. But it's a core component of the broader national quality infrastructure, working in tandem with standards, with metrology. It underpins international trade in that this kind of principle of like evaluated once, accepted everywhere, the mutual recognition of UKAS accreditations as being technically equivalent, extremely important when businesses or companies are thinking about sort of the recognition of their scheme abroad. And I say, in addition to the work that we're doing, we're working in a number of areas in the digital sphere. So in addition to the work that we're doing with the ICO, we're working very closely with DCIT in things like AI assurance, digital identity verification, which I think Sarah alluded to, Internet of Things enabled products, looking at accredited certification schemes for those. So it's kind of a very sort of broad landscape of what we're involved in. So I suppose the key point to me is the fact is that the additional and added assurance from accredited certification can give you as the end user that confidence that things have been done competently and that requirements are being met. And as Steve and Sarah said, I think there's questions at the end, which I'll be happy to take away, but that's it from me. Thanks, everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you, Susie. So we've heard from Sarah from the Information Commissioner's Office about the approval of the contents of a standard itself. We've heard from Susie about the hoops that we as the certification body have to go through, and they are significant. We've been audited twice already this year by UKAS. They make sure that we're on our game and that the certifications, when they're issued, are credible and meaningful for those who've gone through the process. We're going to lead into Tim now, who's the scheme owner. Now, Tim is the author of the standard, and I think it's important to understand the journey that Tim's gone on to actually get the written word to the point where it's now been officially approved. So, Tim, over to you, sir, to talk about the 2+ years, I think it was, of standards development.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So I'm going to briefly cover the why LOCS 23 and how we got here. So really the starting point was, and it's an ICO requirement, was identify the need. My background is I was an IT director in law firms for 25+ years. So I'm very aware of the personal data that law firms and chambers process, and some of the particularly sensitive personal data. And in 2018, I became an independent consultant and started offering DPO as a service. And a number of my clients were, in fact, law firms and some chambers. And one of the things that I became acutely aware of was, if I speak to a managing partner and I would say, okay, are you UK GDPR compliant, or GDPR compliant as it was? Of course, the answer is always yes, of course we are. My follow-up question is then, how do you know? And that's where it gets interesting, because of course, we all know that the law is UK GDPR, and we all know that we have to comply with it. But how do we know how we're doing with it? And that was the biggest challenge that any DPO I've ever met has with their organization, because where can we be 100% confident that we are absolutely, let's use the word, compliant with UK GDPR? And that, for me, is the beauty of a certification scheme, or rather an ICO certification scheme. Because now what we're really doing is we're providing, and this is for me, the entire objective of this, is to provide something that is measurable, auditable, and certifiable, that takes us to that point that we can say to our clients and to our employees and everybody's personal data that we're processing, that we are compliant with UK GDPR. So that's, for me, identifying the need, which I feel is clearly there. And that also is another element of putting the scope together. Sarah mentioned it's really important that you get the scope right for any certification scheme. And one of the pieces of that is the who. Well, the who in this particular case for this certification scheme is legal services, and for the reasons I mentioned. Now, the next thing is the processing activity. It's really, you can't just certify an organization for everything that they do. You need to define the processing activity that we are certifying here. So for legal services, it's fairly obvious, but it is the client file and processing of personal data on the client file. And that means what we're trying to do here is say, from the moment we start collecting client data to the moment that the matter is closed, and then after that, the data is retained for whatever purposes, in that life cycle of client data, how do we say that everything we're doing, all the activities that are going on around the processing of client data, are UK GDPR compliant? That's what we're looking to achieve, and that's the objective of LOCS 23. So now we've ticked that box off, we know what the processing activity is. The next question is, how much of UK GDPR do we want to apply within this certification scheme? And this is where we got a bit ambitious, because I wanted this to be, well, let's look at the client file. Actually, it's everything. The whole of UK GDPR needs to be applied to this, with perhaps one exception. And that was one of the articles is around the provision of online child services. And that's not something that you get with law firms and processing data on the client file. But that aside, that one small exception aside, the objective of this certification scheme was to apply the whole of UK GDPR. And the next thing, of course, is when you look at the life cycle of client data within the client file, it's not actually just about the entity that originally collects it. So if you are a law firm, let's use that as the example, when you do start to collect client data and client personal data, there's a very strong likelihood at some point this will be shared with third parties, which may be chambers, it may be tech suppliers, it may be translators, who knows what it is, but there will be other entities involved. So if we truly want to cover the entire life cycle of this data, we're talking about other parties. So we introduced into this certification scheme, actually, it's two certification schemes. You can certify as a data controller, a law firm, perhaps a barrister, and you can certify as a data processor, which would be the chambers or a tech services provider. Now, what that also starts to make quite interesting is we can start to look at the development and procurement life cycle, where actually, if you think about it today, when you've got when you're a data controller and you engage data processors, often you have to go through quite extensive questionnaires with lots of questions. If we get to the ideal place where you've got a law firm that certifies as a data controller and then starts to say to its data processors, well, you can either go through this whole procurement due diligence exercise, or if you get your certification, it's much easier for me because now I'm working with someone else who's ICO certified. And what you can start to build up is the entire ecosystem around client data with certifications. And that was another objective, albeit a longer term objective. So when we've got all of that together, that collectively becomes the scope of the certification that the ICO obviously need to approve. Then we get to the nitty gritty, which is the controls. And this is where it gets quite interesting, because the controls are going to be a bunch of statements such as you shall do this or you shall not do this. And if you look at other certifications out there, like the ISO ones, they are not based on the law. They are typically based on an industry best practice that's been adopted and agreed. The first challenge here is we are starting with the legislation, and we've got to somewhat translate a piece of legislation into a set of controls, which is okay until you get to the next part, which is how do we make that auditable? So the real challenge in all of this is taking a piece of legislation, making sure that the controls that you put into your certification meet all of the requirements the ICO have, so that it can be deemed as compliant with UK GDPR. But then, of course, at the same time, the certification body needs to come along and audit this. So those controls can't be vague or fluffy. They need to be something that potentially a non-data protection specialist auditor can simply question an organization and have it evidenced. Does this exist or does this not exist? And how are they going to demonstrate that? And a lot of that also is very important in terms of the guidance that you put within the certification scheme. So it's not just a list of controls, which are then open to interpretation. It's very important that we have guidance, and the guidance can be along the lines of perhaps examples of how one might achieve that control, or even links to existing ICO guidance in that area to give you an idea of what they're looking for. So what you end up with is a set of very specific controls that can be as black and white as possible, so that auditors can say yes or no, but with some guidance to practically assist an organization in getting there. And that's the balance we're looking for. And as Steve mentioned earlier, that's where the scheme owner and the actual scheme itself sits between the ICO requirements and the UKAS requirements. And then just to summarize the sort of the journey that we've taken here, the very first version of this certification scheme was sent to the ICO around about October 2021. So it took just over 2 years, 2 years and a couple of months, to have the final version approved and published by the ICO, which is version 12 in February 2024. And I say final version, but it isn't really. It's the first approved version, because as Sarah mentioned, there is now a duty to keep that updated as we go. And for example, one of the certification schemes Sarah mentioned that is currently under review at the ICO is for financial services. But of course, because when this one was submitted back in 21, nobody was talking about AI. Who can even remember the days when no one was talking about AI? But they weren't, funnily enough. Now that they are, this particular certification scheme, like the financial services one, will likely have an AI component as time moves on and as we understand more about the requirements for that. So certification schemes are living things, and there is a responsibility to keep them updated as the law changes. But where we are today is that the one that is live and published is version 12. And then, of course, even though that was published by the ICO and approved by them in February 24, there's the final piece, which was making sure that UKAS are happy with two things, really. One, the operation manual that the scheme owner also has to produce that kind of has a bunch of guidelines for the certification body. And then the fact that the certification body themselves get approved by UKAS as able to apply the certification itself to an organization under the standards that UKAS apply to certification bodies. And that's where we are today. We've gone through that entire journey, and we're right at the very end now, which means Steve can open the doors and take on applications from other organizations who are ready to start, probably already started the journey in terms of getting ready for certification and can now look to be actually certified. So thanks for your time, and hopefully we can, if there are any questions, again, as the others have said, we can cover those at the end.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim. And I think the first part of today's webinar is talking about the key people who are involved in the creation, approval, and the implementation of GDPR certification schemes, so that people realize that these things don't just pop up overnight. And certainly looking at Tim's timeline, I know, because we've done it ourselves, the amount of work that goes into developing the criteria themselves and the review that takes place with the ICO is significant. But that's not the end of the story. So we've created something, the ISO's approved it, UKAS is doing our audit process now. We need people to go out and test this. And so I'm delighted to welcome a panel. I won't introduce you all for the purposes of time, but a panel session today to talk about those companies who have adapted or adopted LOCS 23 for their businesses as early as possible. So they've helped us with our pilot and also have gone through some of the certification processes since then. And it's going to be moderated by Orla Kelly, who's unique in the world of LOCS in that her business brief has been certified by us as a data processor. But she's also been working with organizations to take them through the process. So I thought Orla would be very well placed to moderate the panel session for today. So Orla, I'm going to hand over to you today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. I'm delighted to be here. Whenever Tim approached me several years ago now and talked about this, I thought it was a great idea that he had. I along with my team, had been working with law firms and chambers since 2016 to help meet GDPR compliance requirements. But until the existence of LOCS 23, there was no clear pathway to understanding what compliance was, and certainly nothing that was backed by the regulator. So congratulations to everybody involved and to Tim for having brought up the concept. I mean, certainly from my perspective, not only could our clients find a way to genuinely be GDPR compliant and reduce risk, but the fact that the ICO will take into consideration if you have a certification in the event of a data breach. When they investigate and issue any potential sanctions, they will bear in mind that you have a certification was a key impetus for me in moving through the pilot process. And I'd like to know from the other people on the panel, what was the impetus for you to get involved? Why did you become one of the first adopters of LOCS 23? Rowan, maybe kicking off with yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I love to be an early adopter in anything, Orla, as you know, and I'm probably unique in that I love an audit as well. So I'm always happy to volunteer for these things. But really to answer that question that Tim posed earlier, you know, we think we're compliant, but how do you really know? And we just wanted to be able to prove that to ourselves, but also to the people whose data we're looking after, you know, to our clients, to be able to say, no, we're getting these things right, so you can really trust us with the other things that we want to support you with as well. So that was the key for us, just to answer that question for ourselves and our clients.
Alex, Kaylee, Jane, anything jumping out at yourselves as to why you decided to move forward, which is quite a high investment, particularly at a pilot stage, but what was the benefit, or what made you want to do it?
Well, for me, it was I think it will get to the stage where this is something that's expected, if not required, in certain client bases as part of procured process. And I thought, well, actually, we could kick the can down the road, or we could just get on with it and work out where the gaps are and find out how good or bad we are. My view was we were in pretty good shape, but as we've already heard, I didn't actually have anybody else to say, no, you're not, Alex. So it was really that. And I think also, I advise on data protection. I'm the firm's data protection compliance person, and I'm also the one who's dealing with procured process, where we are seeing increasing numbers of questions about data protection compliance. So there's another very good reason to say, well, actually, let's have a look at our own compliance and see if we have any gaps, so that we can really answer a lot of those questions with confidence.
Very good. Jane, what about yourself? Anything in particular that stood out for you to move into this process?
Sure. Well, I would reiterate what the others said around getting that independent sort of third-party overview, just to give us that assurance that what we think is compliance and our sort of methods for ensuring compliance with data protection rules were actually in line with standard practice and what is expected, from an independent third-party perspective. We had done an enormous piece of work back pre-2018, prior to the GDPR coming into force, where we had an overview of our entire business and our GDPR data protection compliance. Since then, we'd obviously been monitoring and reviewing our processes and making sure that we're keeping up to date with developments. But we thought the LOCS 23 certification was a really valuable opportunity to take a specific rain check, take a sort of high level overview of our entire compliance position to make sure that we're on the right tracks. And as Alex said, to identify any gaps that may be in existence.
And Kaylee, moving it on to yourself and thinking a little bit more about the actual business opportunity that exists there, I think you've already found some benefits to having LOCS 23 rolled out into 30 Park Place, the first chambers to have achieved this last year. Can you speak to any of the business benefits that you've come after? You've moved into year 2 of your achievement at this stage.
I know that we'd noticed that certain like government departments had started to request that we had things like Cyber Essentials Plus in place, and we now know that they're looking more at the GDPR compliance things in addition to cyber security. So it's been a benefit in that sense, and it's actually nice to be able to evidence exactly what we've got. From a Chambers perspective as well, and from my perspective, it's really nice to have something to be able to say to the barristers in Chambers, you have to do this because we now have this certification, so they have to comply with it. So we know that everybody in Chambers is compliant to the standard we require them to be. So not only has it got the nice side of things, that it's actually put us ahead of our competitors, especially in like Cardiff, I suppose. I know that the other chambers are now starting to move in the same direction, which is great for us. But from my personal perspective, it definitely makes it easier for managing barristers and their devices to be able to say you have to comply with these rules because we have this certification.
I can't believe, Kaylee, you'd be suggesting that barristers would require that level of management to comply with something. I say that as the barrister myself. And so, I mean, it looks like Rowan does like an audit, but most other people don't. I definitely do not. And I have to say, having spent so many years auditing our clients, I do feel like we had to take a real tough dose of our own medicine in going through this process. It's robust. And I'm guessing the pilot was more difficult than what anyone else will find coming through. And I know that we all hope for that, particularly ADISA. But did anybody face any challenges that were perhaps unexpected? I mean, I know that I'm speaking to some people here who actually advise on data protection. Alex, I'm thinking of yourself particularly. So, I mean, you have all of the legal knowledge that's required. You advise other clients on this. How did you find compliance as opposed to legal advice, and what, if any, challenges were there?
Shoe on the other foot. I was like, oh, it's not very nice being on this side. So yeah, I'm not with you, Rowan, on that. I was like, I'm not sure I like this side of it. But I think I think it's useful from an advisory point of view to actually be on the other side of an audit and actually be thinking about things and be challenged, to be honest. I think that it really made me realise how many things were done in the practice that weren't actually captured or documented anywhere. That was a bit of a challenge for us. There was things that were happening, but maybe we just hadn't kind of concisely captured that. Yes, giving up the time and sitting and having somebody interrogate what you do every day, and also sitting with that advisory hat on, thinking, kind of challenging myself, thinking, is this correct, and kind of trying to squash down that lawyer in me and just try and kind of make sure that I'm adhering to the process. That was actually quite hard, harder than I thought it was going to be.
Okay. Any other challenges that were presented in the audit phase that maybe you hadn't really expected?
I'm happy to jump in and just like the challenges that we had were the nice thing for us was that we were able to use this as an opportunity to really pull together all of that information in terms of those bits that probably weren't covered in terms of documentation or data, that the ways that the business actually deals with things on a day-to-day basis that we might know, but we haven't necessarily kind of got in a good sense of order. One of the things that we struggled with was liaising with our third parties. So for us, it was IT companies who are outside of chambers, who we have to engage with. We have to understand how they're working to satisfy ourselves that everything is compliant. But actually, the flip side of that was, while some of that communication can sometimes be difficult, to actually have somebody taking you through that and helping you with the standards that we're working towards. Again, that, as Kaylee mentioned earlier, almost the stick to beat people with, to say, we have to do this. We have to understand what you're doing in this area so that we can comply. It's just really helpful to have that kind of written guidance and a complete understanding of the questions we should be asking. So now I've come out of that process feeling 1,000 times more confident in the processes that we have in place and that our third parties have in place, because I've had the opportunities to ask those questions in a formulated way.
I think if I was thinking about with a helicopter view in terms of challenges that the businesses are facing going through the process, because at Briefed, we've helped several of you guys get through the process, and we've another 10 businesses that we're working with. It is the IT companies that are probably our first red flag, to the point where we're now getting to understand which ones are great at answering this and which ones aren't. Rowan, I think yours did particularly well, but it does show that trying to get through an audit process, but working with organisations that don't necessarily jump every time you want them to jump, IT companies being one of them, does add a layer of complexity that anyone in the audience, if they're thinking about this, might want to think about how they get to make sure that their IT company would get involved. Jane, Kaylee, anything that came up for you during the audit process that you think might be worth flagging to other people thinking about doing this, that they could maybe learn from?
It was not having things written down, the processes. That was the main thing, the main learning exercise for us. And now it's become second nature. If you're introducing a new process, just write down every step.
It's not that you had to introduce many new processes, as you had to have evidence that you did it. Yeah. That's a lot of what we're noticing. Absolutely. Alex, what about yourself? Or Jane? Similar, was it?
Similar, I would reiterate the point about having the processes in place, but not necessarily documenting them. And I guess a mirror to that as well is sort of demonstrating a negative. So having to say that we don't do something in a certain way because we that's not a process that we undertake as a business. And the other thing I was just going to say about the process that we underwent was sort of something Tim said earlier resonated on the whole point around when he was developing the standard, that you have the legal obligations as set out in the law, and then the fact that this particular certification is a particular translation of those obligations, and it has to be sufficiently clear in order to be auditable. And we found that sometimes our translation of the law hadn't sort of been completely aligned. So it was just a matter of making sure that, how we demonstrate compliance can be communicated appropriately into the standard, and how the standard expects you to get the tick in the box.
That's certainly one of the things that I found a great benefit for, and Tim and I talked about this a lot, is that when we're advising law firms and chambers about what compliance looks like, it's a grey area and it's open to interpretation, and you often have a room full of lawyers who can all argue in any direction, and at some stage you have to make a call about what that is. And you don't really know if it's right or if it's wrong until, you know, unless something went wrong, ironically, and then the ICO would say that you've done that wrong, and that has happened in chambers cases in the past. Whereas a laptop wasn't bolted to a desk, and that's when they found out they hadn't reached the right criteria. So this has been the key benefit, is clarity, very, very clear, and it just removes that ability to have a debate or need to have a debate, because Tim has written it clear and ADISA have interpreted it in that capacity. So just wrapping up on this particular panel, where do you see LOCS 23 in the future in terms of the legal sector and compliance? Kaylee, you indicated you felt, maybe I'm wrong, but Kaylee, I felt you thought it was the future.
I think so. It's quite a good benchmarking exercise, and I think that other people, like government bodies and things, can use that to know if, when they're sending instructions out to you, it's going to be in a secure environment. We've had this with one case in particular, that we were the only chambers, I think, at the time who were allowed to access the papers outside of the government building. Everybody else had to go on site to actually access papers, because we could evidence that we have the appropriate controls in place when we receive the brief.
Because you have LOCS. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that more departments are going to go in a similar direction, and eventually that will just become normal.
Okay, Rowan, I see you nodding with that. Before I move into the law firms, would that be your thought process for chambers?
Yeah, I think so. I think if any chambers are used to completing tenders for local authority work, those types of things, I think this will become the norm, that they expect these types of standards. We already see it with some places asking for ISO type certification. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if this just became the standard that everybody has to comply with. And as somebody said earlier, let's get ahead of the game, and let's be there before it becomes a requirement, so you're not kind of panicking at that point.
Yeah, Alex, I think it was you that said that. I can see you nodding. From a law firm perspective, and particularly advisory and around data protection, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with what's already been said. I think that it will become an expectation. I actually think it should make some of those procured processes in particular a bit easier, because there's massive variance at the minute as to what the different organisations who are tendering for legal services are asking around data protection. So I think they'll make it easier. I think it will give some of those organisations and any client a lot more reassurance once there's more understanding around it. And certainly from our point of view, I'm already seeing the benefit of it, because we've had our first meeting on the back of going through the audit process, and I've got a much clearer path now for the next 12 months as to what needs to be done around compliance, and what processes and procedures might look at going forward. And it's also driving improved behaviours around things like, somebody else talked about it, technology adoption. I think it's really important from that point of view as well.
Jean, what about yourself?
Yes, I think it's the beginning of a virtuous circle, isn't it, really? So from a client perspective, obviously, the level of information that they want to know from us in terms of our data security and data protection compliance is increasing. So if we can point to the certification as independent assurance for them, and the certification therefore becomes more high profile and is taken up more widely, then that becomes an expectation from them. And then that whole process can just be shortcut to an extent, standardized. And then the questions that we have to answer for the various clients could be just sort of consistent across the board. And that process just becomes a lot easier. And the clients can be a lot more confident in the outcome of it, I suppose.
Ideally, it will shortcut all of that stuff, and the dreaded questionnaire that comes from law firms into chambers about what they do. I can tell you nobody's keen on those. So if that kind of time and energy spent trying to answer multiple questions in different types of ways can be shortcut, that in itself will be a benefit. So it will. So thank you to everybody on the panel. Handing back over to Steve, because I know he's going to open Q&A now.
Thanks very much for that panel session. Now we're going to open up to everybody, to all the previous speakers. Welcome back to some questions. So the Q&A panel is open. I've got a couple which have been sent to me over here, so I might start off There's one here, Sarah, for you. I'll translate it. I apologize. I'll put it into something which I think is more fair to ask you in a live environment. What's the ICO's view on non-use of a certification scheme if one is available?
It's written into the law as a voluntary accountability mechanism, so there's nothing we can do to force organisations to do it. But I think for all the reasons the panel have just given, which is really reassuring for me to hear that it's working in the way that it's intended, so that organisations can prove their compliance in a commercial environment as well as to individuals whose information is being processed. But yeah, I mean, obviously, I think we already said earlier, myself and Tim, or all I can't remember, we do take this into account. Obviously, this is all relatively new, so we haven't had that situation occur where an organisation who's certified has had a breach or an investigation that's reached the point where we would want to take regulatory action. But if organisations have kind of followed all the rules and they can evidence that, then that's going to be taken as a mitigating factor in that. But prior to that, just having that is more likely to improve compliance anyway, which I think has just kind of been proven by the panel there. So yeah, we can't force organisations to, but hopefully, as Jane was just saying, the more awareness of this that there is, the more uptake there is. It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy then, hopefully, that there'll be more expectation, shall we say, rather than a requirement to.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. It's one for Tim, actually, because I think it's picking up, I'm guessing this is picking up on Jane's comment. If we disagree with the standard, how can we make our feelings known? So the interpretation of the law, Jane, I think you talked about that. Tim, and you mentioned that the standard is a living and breathing construct as well. Maybe you can field that one.
Yeah, sure. So thanks to all the people that went through the pain of the pilot phase. I'd like to think we've got to the point where there's very little, if any, vagueness left in there. However, there will always be, as there is with ISO 27001 or 9001 or anything, there will always be the potential to interpret a control in one of two ways, perhaps. And the important thing here is, first of all, the certification body. So providing the certification body are in a place where they can have and they should be able to have some kind of wiggle room here to determine that it has been evidenced, then that's okay. If we ever get to the point where actually the certification body says that really is not our interpretation of what's required here, but the organization says, well, I want to challenge this, then the way I see that happening is the certification body would potentially come back to the scheme owner and say, what was the intention here? And then we would have that discussion. And if there's still a challenge, I would go back to Sarah at the certification team and say, okay, this is an interesting point. There are one or two paths here. Do either or both constitute compliance with UK GDPR from the ICO's perspective? Because that's what we're trying to achieve. And I'm sure between all of that conversation, we would get to the point where, and I can't see how we wouldn't, bearing in mind the journey we've already been through to get this certification over the line, I can't see how we wouldn't find a way that we would at least, I mean, because of course, the potential is the organisation challenging it are simply wrong. And we could go back to them and say that, no, it's the way it is, it's the way the certification body has understood it, and there is no variance. Or they have identified another route that the ICO said, yes, that would be acceptable too. But that, for me, would be the way that would be resolved.
Fantastic. And I should stress as well, as the certification body, we are publishing more guidance as we go, as these things come up, because we've only done half a dozen or so audits. And so it's been interesting discussing viewpoints on legal matters with clearly people who are far better qualified than our auditors. And some of this does require some pragmatism as well. And so that will be built out into this body of work which will form the guidance which grows and grows and grows. Now, I'm just aware of time, so there's some questions coming through. One for the panel, I guess, of the early innovator. How much time? Time's come up. There's 3 questions on time here. How much time did you have to invest in the process to become certified? Rowan, maybe if you can kick us off on that one, perhaps.
Yeah, happy to. I won't kind of pull the wool over. It's not a quick process. It's you know, we had a team of us internally with assistance from Briefed looking at this for, I think it took us, Orla might be able to help me, I think it took us a good 3 or 4 months from start to finish, and clearly not just working on that, but that, you know, full time. I guess it really depends on the order of documents and the order of everything that you have internally. We are quite structured and we have quite a lot of things in the right place, but we still had to go and do some searching and ask lots of questions of IT, as I alluded to earlier. So that sometimes takes time. It is a time-consuming process. The audit was a day, followed by calls either side, and it's something that you do need to be prepared to invest that time into, I would say, to make sure you get the right result out of it and make sure you're providing the data properly.
Yeah, I think Rowan, as you say, you're fairly well structured and well set up. For any business well set up, that kind of 3 to 4 months sounds probably accurate enough. Provided your IT company engage well and there's not a lot of annual leave, because that ironically, as you move into a 4-month period, suddenly you move into annual leave. We certainly have clients that are taking longer than that. They maybe started an IT project in the middle of it, which scuppered the whole thing. So it's a learning curve. But you mean 3 to 4 months is 12 to 16 weeks as a project, if you know you've got the stuff to hand over to us and we can organize it in the correct way for you, really, or advise. Alex, what about you? You're sort of similar, really. I saw you nodding your head there.
Yeah, no, I mean, that sounds about right in terms of our investment time here. One of the things that we did, which I think was really helpful, was that we set up what was essentially a data room with Briefed so that they could see what we had at the off, before we kind of got into the nitty-gritty of what else might be needed and where we were against the standard. But I would say that is probably right. But then obviously once you've kind of got to that stage, you then into kind of timetables, and you do end up accommodating, as you say, annual leave and all the rest of it. So and then the audit day was a day commitment with emails and calls either side. So yeah, I mean, it is going to take time. There were 2 of us here working on it, and we used Briefed as well to assist.
So I think I'm just aware of time because we're over the hour now. There are some questions coming through which are transactional questions. So I'll just say that all the questions that have come through, we will reply to them en masse at the end. And send a list out to the attendees. It's things like costs and things like that. That's probably nothing for the benefit of the panel. I will ask one more question before we finish, though. There's some grouping them together. There are questions like we have ISO 27001. What's the difference between LOCS 23? We do patch management, secure firewall. What's the difference between LOCS 23? Tim, I'm going to put it back to you because this is your baby, the father, if you like, of this process. So some of the other certifications which have been mentioned are more technical controls. Just explain the difference between LOCS. I think you've done already, but there's quite a few questions on this. What's different about LOCS 23 than holding an information security certification, for example?
Yeah, this does come up a lot. And for obvious reason, because we've got mature certifications out there like 27001 and Cyber Essentials, some of which have become mandatory in government procurement like Cyber Essentials. So it's a very good question. But the quick and easy answer is they are different. They are the scope and the intent is very different. Something like Cyber Essentials is a very broad, are we doing the basic controls and protections for Cyber Essentials from an outside-in attack, essentially. 27001 is, are we applying best practice as regarded by the IT world for what we're doing from an IT perspective? It does branch out slightly from IT, but that's its focus. An ICO certification is about applying the law, i.e. UK GDPR, and are we compliant with it? Now, yes, there is some crossover. There will be in the technical and organisational measures that we read about, and in Article 30 and other areas in GDPR or UK GDPR, it will touch upon some of those IT matters, but it's a very small part of it in reality. Far more of it is process, training, accountability, documentation, and the work we do with personal data, the way we process it, the way we protect it, our transparency around it, all of those things that do not fall into any of those other certifications. So really what I say to organizations is, if you already have Cyber Essentials or 27001, there are some good things about this. One, it means your organization is already of the mindset that you like to get a certification to sign off that you're doing something right. Great. That means you're also the type of organization who will probably do well with LOCS 23. Now, does any of it give me a head start? And that is a maybe. And it has to be a maybe because there are some unknowns here. If I got ISO 27001 last week and I had to evidence to the 27001 auditors all of these controls, the chances are the certification body, ADISA, comes in to see you the week after. You can use exactly the same evidence. So you've got a massive head start and it will be a very quick process. However, your 27001 certification might have been a year ago or 2 years ago. So is it still relevant? That's for the certification body to determine when they do your audit. Plus the other factor is the scope. 27001, it's very easy to cheat with the scope. There are numerous organizations who you will see the 27001 badge on their website, but when you look at their scope certificate, it's one data center in Scotland. And, you know, actually, when you look at it, does that apply to my entire business and my processing activities? Probably not. So yes, they can contribute certainly towards achieving LOCS 23, but they are very different. And one other thing I'll just quickly add on here is I've had a very interesting conversation with insurance companies, because insurance companies, cyber insurance is getting more and more expensive for obvious reasons. And partly now because AI is coming into play and there's a perception of lack of control with data. And so insurance companies are looking to bring those premiums back down, make themselves more affordable. In the IT world, they can use 27001 and Cyber Essentials, and they can say, right, in the IT world, if you've got those certifications, that gives us as an insurance company some comfort. But GDPR came along and has this potential 4% of global revenue penalty. Now, we know that's extremely unlikely that will ever be applied, but an underwriter will say, yeah, it might be extremely unlikely, but it exists. And how on earth can I find some kind of assurance that this is not going to happen? Then you explain the ICO certification and they say, something's come along that one, Article 83 says it must be taken into account. So that almost automatically says there will never be a 4% penalty. I, as an underwriter, can now take this as a form of assurance, therefore start to bring premiums down. So again, they are starting to look at it as potentially certainly different to 27001 and Cyber Essentials and covering something potentially more important, which is actually a legal requirement to do something.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tim. I'm just aware of time, so I'm going to draw today to a close. Thank you to Sarah and Ben. I've just discovered I didn't have the panel up, the Q&A actually on the webinar session itself. Thank you, Sarah and Ben, for answering those questions directly. For everybody else that I've got over here as well, we will be sending out answers to your Q&As as a result of the wash up after this. I'd like to thank the attendees online for coming today, but most of all, those who've taken part in the webinar, the speakers and panelists today. Thank you so much for your commitment to not only today, but also to seeing LOCS 23 become a reality in the legal services sector. So thank you very much today. There is a way that you can ask ongoing questions. I'm a Luddite, so if you scan that QR code, the magic happens and it goes to a website, or you can go to adisacertification.com and there's a way of answering or Q&As to us directly there as well about the certification process. So thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for your time and enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.